Hello, hello.
Hello, Rishi. How are you today?
Excellent. We're back with another round of live project feedback. We do these once every month or two for those of you who are new. Same as always, we review projects that have reached the top 50 on the Pioneer leaderboard and then have followed up by asking us specific questions or specific areas that they want feedback on. And so we'll review a handful of those projects as well as kind of in an experiment of our own, just some other websites that we've come across that we think are interesting. We're just going to poke around and give them general product and landing page feedback, hopefully with the goal of just having some interesting discussion. So Andrew, you wanna start with the first few companies, and then
All
Daniel
right,
will go next.
let's go ahead and get started then. I'll go and share my screen and start walking through some companies. So, start us off. Can you see my screen, everybody? And Boggl.ai?
Yep.
All right. So Boggl.ai is asking about how to prioritize monetization versus adoption. So, and also about how to like price and how to target specific kind of customers. So take a look at their website and get a sense of what they do. So Boggl create mind-boggling product documents. So let's take a look. Product managers spend a lot of time, here it is, missing details. The shout out, the thing I will say here is that these people look very different from what I'm used to on the typical startup landing pages, where you usually see those like faceless humans and very 2D images. These like 3D renders are a nice breath of fresh air, I guess. All right. Product information is fragmented. Okay, why Boggl? Okay. It's basically write the perfect PRD and all right, so let me take a look at their question again. So how do you prioritize this monetization versus adoption? So, and pricing models and price points for SaaS product teams. So for a tool like this, I would say, let's think about who your target customer is. Your target customer really is like a product manager or someone who is managing a product team. And you need to ask yourself kind of like, what tools are they using today to do this? Are they doing this in like a Google Doc? Are they trying to do this in Jira itself, or trying to do this in product board, or maybe some other adjacent tool? And I guess ask yourself like, how are they, what's their process today, and how are they doing this? Who else needs to look at these documents and that kind of thing? So when you're thinking about like monetization versus adoption, when you're this early on, I think it's okay not to have a clear answer on what monetization looks like, just because that's not really what you're concerned about as of yet. You're concerned about whether or not you are building something that your target customer, that is solving a main pain point for your target customer. And right now, your hypothesis is that your target customer is a product manager, and their main pain point is they spend a lot of time on writing these product roadmaps, and there's a lot of problems with them. Either they're not read, they're not kept up to date, or they're hard to keep track of, etc. So you have this hypothesis, and your solution is, can we make writing and maintaining these roadmaps better for product managers? So before you even think about monetization, I guess you got to go talk to some product managers and ask them, is this really a problem for you? And if they say, yes, it is, then you can start asking them things like, oh, well, how much would you pay for a solution like this? Building something, getting in their hands and seeing if they use it, that sort of thing. So that's the sense that I get from this. If I were to balance these two things, I would focus more on whether or not, given how early it is, like, are you solving a real problem for product managers? Maybe it's writing roadmaps, maybe it's something else. But I think validating that is like the first step. So then moving on to monetization, because I know that's another one of your questions, is like, how does pricing models or price points and that kind of work do you? Where should you be highly specialized and charge more? Should you be more generic? I think selling into B2B means that you don't, at the end of the day, if you're building a product like this, you don't want to have like a single product manager paying money like out of their own pocket, and that's kind of how you make your money. That isn't really a sustainable business model, because you need to acquire a lot of like individual product managers at all these different companies, and each of them are paying you a very small amount of money. And that's not really how you build a big company if you're going after like enterprise SaaS. What is big is figuring out ways of getting value from other people that are involved in this process. So I always think that like any sort of seat-based model or charging in where multiple people are interfacing with a piece of software is kind of how any sort of big enterprise software company is built. So asking yourself, well, we're solving this one problem for product managers. Are we able to solve this problem for, adjacent users, where it's, if you're an engineer that needs to stay up to date on the product roadmap, if you're a product manager is like boss, you need to manage like a bunch of different product roadmaps across your product team, that sort of thing. How can you create value on each of these different shareholders? So it's not just a single product manager that's deriving value from your product. So your pricing model, at the end of the day, if you're going down this B2B software route, is figuring out how to create and extract value from different people at a company, not just a single person. So I would be focusing on pricing models that support that kind of approach. Yeah, I hope that's helpful. At the end of the day, like in terms of how much to charge, I think that was another part of your question, is you don't want to, like, you're not going to be making the majority of your money in the early days, like it is for any company. If you look at kind of the S1s for any of these big enterprise software companies, a small amount of their customers account for a very large percentage of their revenue. And that's how it is once you're at that later stage. But that's really not how these companies start. Most of them start by having much more simpler customer bases. Like if you're selling into startups, or selling to much smaller companies, or maybe like Series B companies, that kind of thing, before you kind of land those big enterprise contracts that constitute the majority of your revenue. So I wouldn't worry too much about that as of yet. I'd focus more on solving the more specific problems at maybe like a product manager at a single company, and then figuring out ways of getting other people on board and adopting a pricing model that supports, selling to an organization as opposed to a single product manager. So yeah, that's my feedback for you. Hopefully that's helpful on Boggl. Moving on to the next one, which is Gomada. And their question is also pretty similar. And their question is, what's more important, like traction or proving willingness to pay for a product like this? So the product here is making, let's take a look at their landing page and see what they do. Make remote team building a habit. So it looks like team building sessions. Finding your team's strengths and weaknesses, building a stronger team, making it auto-scheduling things. Okay, so it sounds like you're organizing like activities like where, I don't know, if I think of like what we do, code names or Pictionary or like a Jackbox game or something like that to help remote teams to do more things together. So the question around traction versus proving a willingness to pay. So I think it is people, like when you go out to investors or go to startup land and go to like watch these videos, you hear a lot of feedback around like traction solves all problems. Like everyone wants traction. Like that's the main metric you point to at the end of the day to see if something's working. And that's true. That's how like pretty much everybody looks at a business and evaluates it based on looking at numbers and charts going up and to the right. But I would argue that in the very early days, traction is a little like less important than you think in terms of like having a lot of users, a lot of numbers, that kind of thing. Where traction is proves out something very, very important, which is that there are people that are willing to pay or willing to use your products. However, before you can get there, you do need to prove out like a willingness to pay amongst a smaller population. And I think it's a hard thing to try to get a lot of users for a single product before you've kind of validated your whatever hypothesis is that you have. And I call this like the pre-product market fit stage, where traction I think is more applicable to if you're like post-product market fit and you have that traction, then it becomes more numbers driven. But in the early days, you're trying out like a bunch of stuff. Like here, like to comp it to the previous one, your hypothesis is that people have a hard time organizing team building activities today, whether through Zoom or other means, and they would pay to have a product that does this for them. And I think it's important to validate this thing, and traction can be a part of it, right? Like if you get 10 paying customers to use this kind of thing, that's like great. But to do that, you need to get your first paying customer. So I think that is getting your first paying customer is like the most important thing above all else, before you can move on to worrying about scaling or getting more people and that kind of thing. So if I were to balance those two things, I would basically say, yeah, focus on figuring out how can we validate that people are willing to pay for this before we go and start scaling out and focusing on growth and traction and all that sort of stuff. So if I take a look at pricing, it looks like free, premium, enterprise. Yeah, focus on figuring out if people are willing to pay for something like this, like if getting premium and enterprise customers. Because if I had to guess, the main thing here is like you're competing against someone at a company taking the initiative to start a room in like get people to download Roblox or to start like an online code names game or something like that and sharing it with their team. And you need basically to ask yourself, well, are people willing to pay to not do something like that or pay for a more streamlined or polished experience? And I think the jury is probably still out on something like that. So, you know, you'd want to validate that before you start worrying about doing paid acquisition or growing and all that sort of stuff. I think you don't want to start growing before you kind of validate that, because I think it's a mistake to spend a lot of money on ads if you have a product that you're not exactly sure if it really solves a problem yet, because you might get misleading data if you spend a lot of money to acquire users and you're not really evaluating the health of your business, I think, in the right way. So, all right, that's Gomada. Moving on to the next one, which is Blue Lock AI. And their question is, pricing is hard. How do you figure out how to price? And you're right, pricing is hard. There are entire teams at lots of companies being paid lots of money to figure out how much to charge for a product. I know that like specialization is tough here, where like everyone has a different approach if you're doing like software or cybersecurity. I think a few useful rule of thumbs here are, if you're going after enterprise, charge more. I think that's probably one of the main takeaways I've gotten from talking to a lot of like companies going after like cybersecurity or enterprise, is that at the end of the day, like the amount that you can charge is based off alternatives than it is based off the amount of money that it takes you to make something. Where if your alternative is 5 software engineers that are specializing in cybersecurity, that's the upper bound for how much you can charge at the end of the day. And that's usually a lot more than how much it takes to maintain the software, which is why software companies have such great margins, because the alternative is hiring a bunch of people internally to build something, which tends to be very expensive. So when I think about pricing, the single rule of thumb that I can go by, and there aren't that many of them, is that you can probably charge more. Let's talk specifically about what you're doing here, which is cybersecurity threat detection. So we're doing AI-driven threat detection to detect threats in real time, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's a few cybersecurity companies that have this kind of thing as a value proposition. I'm not as experienced in cybersecurity as I know about like software and that kind of thing, but I imagine that people are building, like, what you can charge for this is like, I would imagine some sort of annual contract with a company that cares a lot about cybersecurity. I don't really have a sense for vertical here. Like, we're focusing on things like, I don't know, if you're focusing on healthcare companies or like larger enterprises versus smaller startups. I'm not exactly sure based on this landing page, but ask yourself the simple question of like, how much is this worth to them, and how much can I charge up to that amount? And odds are it's probably quite a bit. There's probably a lot to learn from existing cybersecurity companies. Like if you look at any of the public ones and look at their journeys or how much they're charging for their products, I think that looking at those kinds of comps are the best way to kind of think about pricing. Just because if you think about it, they probably have had lots of people at their team spend a lot of time thinking about how to price, and they've come to some conclusion. I think the benefit of coming when a model has already been established is you can learn a lot from what people have done previously. And yeah, if you think about how software works, this like the seat-based models or like the annual contracts, all of that is relatively standard and is running off the coattails of other companies that have done similar things in the past. So I've kind of given you the general framework of looking at comps, pricing more, etc. I think at the end of the day, the answer you'll get most is like from your conversations with customers, just ask them, like say like this is how much it costs, and just see their reaction. I think that's kind of the best way to gauge. Like if someone says yes pretty happily, odds are you're undercharging. So I think that's probably where you'll get the most sense of how much people are willing to pay, is just like talking to your customers and throwing out a number that's more than you thought and seeing what their reaction is. I think it's probably the right way to go about it. Yeah, hope that's helpful. Moving on to Daniel, I think is taking it on from here. Starting with HydePHP, the static site generator you've been waiting for.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you very much. This is a nice landing page. This landing page to me sort of reeks, this sort of nice, I guess this type of drop shadow is coming back in fashion now. Anyway, thank you.
Sorry, to start, before you give the general reaction, their question is, should I design my landing page to target a more general audience or just developers?
Well, it's interesting. The landing page is definitely targeted at a general audience, I would guess. I mean, if you look at the text, but then the buttons maybe slightly more targeted at developers. I don't know. I mean, I think it's interesting to sort of, if I were in your shoes, I'd probably go figure out who your customers are and how technical they are. Maybe the idea is that because PHP is a more simple language, you're going to be able to target people that aren't sort of as developer-y, in which case I think it wants a simple language, maybe even more simple than what you have. Maybe it's not a static site generator, but it's just like simple PHP hosting or simple web hosting. I don't know. If your audience is more technical, then you should do that. It's sort of hard for me to answer because I don't really know, who are the, cluster of people that are not using existing static site hosting solutions that like them. That's what I would think about.
Yeah. I think, Ken, when we spoke in the past about this project, it sounded like you're targeting this whole sort of like open source approach, providing a framework for developers to use. I think it depends on in terms of how you want to position your business before you even think about the landing page. Like if you want to provide like an open source static site generator for developers to use, by all means, target those developers. If you wanted to like commercialize something like this towards an audience of people that were like, that are looking for maybe a hosted solution or something that targets more general, that kind of audience, then you would position the landing page as such. But I think it depends on what you want to do with the business first and foremost. Like right now, my vibe is that it seems like it's more for the open source developer using open source software to work on things. And in which case, like talking about documentation, looking directly to the GitHub, these are the kinds of things that you would want to do. Whereas if you're targeting, you wanted to commercialize something like this, then it would look very different, right? You would have sign up, you would have pricing and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
All right. Hope that's helpful. Moving on to the next one, which is Opus. And Opus is asking questions around who's the right target user? Should I focus on B2B or take a different approach? And they're also would like some feedback on pricing.
All right. Turn clicks into instructions. We're dig into the question. I would say the homepage landing page, I think, could be made a bit more clear. This could just mean so many different things to turn clicks into instructions. As for the question of whether you target B2B or take a different approach, I guess I don't understand what a different approach is. It seems like this is a product that is useful for businesses. And so you might want to think, about selling for businesses. I don't know what another option would be. Maybe you sort of mean, how you plan to sell to people. Like maybe it's just sort of doing sales calls versus trying to grow bottom up. Let's see. Well, this is a tool that could maybe grow sort of bottoms up for small startups, or maybe individual sales reps using it. So you could sort of try that, I guess, and see how it goes. It's certainly easier if you could do that if you can. That is the dream of one too many startups, though, is that they will never have to put on a suit and tie and actually take a sales call. So anyway, give that a go just in case it works, but be prepared for it not working. I would definitely spruce up the sort of clarity of your landing page, and a very simple sort of tip to do that is once you do find a couple of customers and you sort of explain to them over the course of a couple of minutes what you do, you just ask them what they think you do. And then those words are usually a great way to figure out what you should put in your landing page.
Yeah. To talk a little bit more about like who the right target user is, if you're going to B2B and you're talking about like process documentation and all that sort of stuff, it might make sense to specify, like change the copy to target like someone who has to create a lot of like documentation internally at a company, whoever that role is, like doing research on who that role is, like, and start incorporating that into the landing page when you spruce it up is probably the right thing. Where I think it's probably better to talk about a more specific use case as your hero when you're starting out, like instead of like turning clicks into instructions, like maybe something like create like SOPs in seconds or something like that, or someone like, so the person who has to do SOPs at a company looks at that and like, oh, that speaks to me, like I need to solve that kind of problem for myself. So basically in short, like change the copy to target a specific kind of business user if you're going after B2B, and then like, so yeah, spruce up the landing page so that it reflects that instead of just more general, like clicking on buttons, instructions automatically generated. Talk about features that a target user would actually care about if it's someone who's designing like a lot of SOPs or something like that. All right, moving on to the next one, which is Matcha. Matcha's question is landing page feedback and what is the right KPI to focus on in growing our projects? Looks like it's turning online meetups into real meetups.
Yeah. Is this sort of meetup.com ultimately?
It looks like a meetup alternative.
Yeah.
From what I can get. Yeah.
Maybe the idea is yeah, I'm just still trying to understand how it's a little bit different. I guess the idea it is maybe it's just simpler. Maybe it's sort of meetup.com meets Doodle. Anyway, I think the landing page could be made a bit more specific. If the idea is that it's sort of the simplest way to create, meetups, maybe you should communicate that a bit more crisply on the landing page. If there's another sort of reason why this is exciting, like the videos, there seems to be something going on with the URL to IRL, and then we're seeing people on FaceTime. So I think there's something else going on there. But anyway, distilling that a bit, I think, could be helpful. And then they want to know what KPIs they need. Well, this is the type of thing where I think, yeah, I mean, it would be awesome if this was like the #1 way people were sort of meeting online. And so I would just maybe look for a number of meetups. I think Meetup Charge has some premium features they charge for, and so you could do revenue too. But if I was in your shoes, I'd probably just focus on number of meetups around the world facilitated by your service. And you might say, well, like initially that will be like 1 a week, so that's not exciting, a numerical number. So maybe then it's sort of users or total attendees. I think that could be another option. But anyway, those are ideas for you guys. I don't know if you had any other thoughts, Andrew.
I think those are the right things to be tracking. Like when you're this early on, I think when I think about a comp like Lunch Club, for example, is one of the things that comes to mind of like another service that facilitates meetups and thinking about the kinds of things that they track. I think one is that one of the things that they track is like new introductions that end up actually happening, right? Where no, you want to prove obviously like the number of users and meetups on that are happening through your platform, but also how well you're able to facilitate these, like the value that you provide in addition to, actually them organizing it, but your ability to make these introductions. And I know that that's one of the things that Lunch Club measured, because like that's kind of how their AI engine performed, was how well did it actually match these people? How many of these meetups actually happened at the end of the day? So I think those are the right metrics to focus on though. All right. And in this next part, these are all websites of people that are playing in the tournament. We're going to look at a few websites that we've seen from around the web that we think are kind of interesting and give them some general landing page feedback on them. So let's start with, I'll start opening all of them. I'll do the first two, and then
sounds good.
Daniel can take the next two. Just opening all of them real quick, and then I'll start with the first one. All right, let's start with Remake SaaS Rock, which is a great name, by the way. Easily build your own SaaS, multi-tenant framework from Audacity for yourself, off subscriptions, blogging, audit trails, admin portal, rows of permissions, everything. So pretty straightforward thesis. Software companies need to build a lot of the things that are the same. I think there are huge companies that are built for each of these things, like just doing auth, right? You can think of Auth0 or some of the password stitch or these passwordless auth things for subscriptions. I'm sure there's like Revenue Cat and Stripe and these other companies that take that. So these people are saying basically integrate your best of breed from all these different things and get started. So let's take a look at this. I think the idea makes sense. Let's take a look at the landing page in dark mode. I wasn't sure if that's a feature or a Chrome extension that I have or something like that. All right, let's take a look. Okay. Use over 30 founders. Have all these different things. Top class tech stack. All these integrations. Great pricing. Very cool. I feel like I want to click on the GitHub for this. It's like, I don't know, the first thing that comes to mind. Oh, it's just the person. And then these two, not the React SaaS kit, sorry, remix blocks. Presumably what powers this thing. Check out SaaS Rock. All these blocks are from okay. So these are like integrations that allow you to easily integrate all these things like form, subscription, email, all that sort of stuff. And I'm guessing that part of the Remix SaaS comes from Remix, the framework, to make it easy to build these websites. All right, the landing page looks pretty polished, to be honest. It looks good. I have a good sense of what you do based on this. Like the subtext under the hero is a little, the hero text is a little bit long, but I guess if you are doing a lot of these different things, like it's very clear that your target user is a founder, and you're telling them you launch your MVP sooner. You easily build your own SaaS. You give them a bunch of things that they probably care about for their products. In that sense, looks good. I think it's very clear that you're targeting like the founder, and you have a testimony by founders. Like the copy is there for sure. You have this very long list of features of all these different things, and I think there's a few different interesting approaches. Like announcing all these integrations, right, with like Stripe and Zapier and all these sorts of things is definitely nice. And I guess if you're a founder coming to this who's thinking about this integration, then they care about seeing all these long list of things. I wonder if there's a different way of communicating all this. Like, I think you're kind of knocking into their head that we have everything you need to build, like everything you need. And I guess listing this long laundry list of things is the way to go about doing it. Yeah, it's a pretty fleshed out landing page. I think you're targeting the right person. I don't really have that much to add for what I've already said. I guess maybe my only thought is that it's very general. Like you're targeting a lot of different things. Like I said before, each of these has like several companies in each of these spaces. So I wonder if like the value proposition here is more around like mentioning how you tie in these tools that these people already want to use, like whether it's Auth0 or Stripe and all these sorts of things, which you do to a certain extent here, or maybe talking about like stacks as well, like talking about like if you want to build a B2B software company, here's how you would do this, or if you want to build a D2C consumer company, we have like a template for that kind of thing, where you basically make it even simpler for the person to build something by providing these sorts of templates for them, as opposed to just giving them like a huge list of things that they currently use. Odds are that most of the people coming to you kind of have an idea of the different parts of things that constitute the tech stack they need. And maybe they're just looking for a template or something like that. So, all right. That might be this first class tech stack boilerplate for tech apps. Very cool. Anything to add to this one, Daniel?
Looks good.
Yeah, it honestly looks great, is my main feedback that I have for you. Next one is Oculo Health, building you a better brain. Eye tracking, sleep data, and AI to know when your brain is tired. Oh, this is pretty cool. It's basically take a daily eye tracking test to see. I'm curious to see how correlated this is with your performance. This is a complete aside, but the way that I do this personally is I do chest tactics every single day, usually in the mornings, to see like how snappy I am. And I use like my rating chart and my performance to kind of gauge if like I'm on or not. It just reminded me of like what this is doing, where you take an eye tracking test. I can imagine for like pro gamers, you probably do like an aim training test at like the start of your session to see how like crispy your aim is, or how fast you are, how good your reflexes are. Just kind of reminded me of all this. So it sounds like it uses this plus sleep data, plus insights to take better care of your brain. Yeah, overall, I think this is pretty interesting. And I imagine all you need is a phone to do this, where you have like sleep cycle and you have a camera, and using those two things, like you can come up with a composite score. You don't need like a wearable or anything like that. I think is pretty cool. I would say the use case here is like maybe a little bit more on like why, like the thing that Aura and Whoop do around like tracking is around like health and sleep and all that sort of stuff. I think there are tangible benefits to that, like knowing that you sleep better means that you have like better performance the next day, or it gives you kind of like this fitness score before you start your day based on how you slept. The whole building you a better brain is an interesting tagline, but maybe people might have a little bit more of a difficult time connecting with it just because there aren't that many comps like with like the sleep or like fitness and that kind of thing. Maybe yeah. Knowing when your brain is performing, that's like an interesting value proposition. I think you can probably flesh out this landing page a little bit more. Like having a good call to action is good, join our waitlist, but maybe a little bit more on like the why of how this is helpful to you. Maybe some link to some studies, to some things to make it more of like a interesting why at the end of the day. This is pretty cool. The idea is interesting. I always like things where people are building things that it doesn't feel like many other people like. I think when I think about like the whole brain training space and like Lumosity and what those people have done, I think taking it to the next level with a more technical approach is like interesting. But I think the reason why I compared it to Lumosity is that like you want to be able to tell the person that they're not just getting better at their tests, they're actually translating performance, where the whole bear case in Lumosity is that, well, you're just getting better at the games. And here you don't want them to be like, oh, you're just getting better at the eye tracking tests compared to your baseline. So maybe it's a little bit more of the scientific backing of why this is interesting and how it actually correlates to performance. All right, moving on to the next two, which is starting with Daniel. We have dataset.at.
So here's an interesting website that I guess helps people find different data sets and shop for them. There's a bunch of, I think, fairly successful either divisions within companies or independent companies that do this for hedge funds and machine learning developers. I think AWS has something that does this, and I think NASDAQ does too, right? And they're pretty successful. I think, especially with this sort of advent of these models that ingest a huge amount of information, there's probably going to be an increasing need for people to develop to get access to different and proprietary data. And I guess more and more of these models are spitting out information, which maybe decreases the amount of like true human data. And so like, I think an interesting edge for these guys is, if maybe this is a bit too early, but like over time, if they could be a source of like real human data and not standard diffusion images or a text generated by GPT-3 or 4 or 5, I think that could be pretty interesting. Because I think people will probably want that for future model development. It's cool. The landing page is great. Big, bold, Helvetica Neue text. I think the I don't really understand, I guess, why you would have a URL claimer. Do you? Like, what does having a URL matter, Andrew?
It's a good question. It feels like more of a thing, like I'm seeing two things here. One is for businesses, like to organize data sets and import them easily and that kind of thing, which case this probably isn't necessary. But I can also imagine a world of like the consumer, like hosting your own data sets and having that be able to be shared. Like if I think about a comp, like someone's GitHub, but for their data sets kind of thing, in which case the URL claimer is important. In which case, let me cop that Andrew one real quick. Hopefully I got that. But yeah, that's what I could imagine. The comp that I can think of actually is a company called Adult Hub. I don't know if you've heard of this one before, Daniel, but also trying to be like this. This one is for, I guess, it has like this whole Git interface or SQL interface for data sets. It looks like they're doing some more database stuff now, but if I remember correctly, they have like a bunch of discoverable data sets as well. Although this might be different now. But yeah, the website looks great. I imagine that with the proliferation of all this new, like all these new models like Daniel said there, ingesting data and stuff, there's probably a lot of ways that these are stored internally at companies, either in a bunch of S3 buckets or somewhere else, and providing a better interface for that definitely makes sense for these companies. So, all right, moving on to the last one, which is Blue Target. For you, Daniel.
Let me load it up here. All right, all the power of artificial intelligence without friction in minutes. I guess there's two different things here. One is an API that gives you access to machine learning models, and then the other is a service that lets you deploy models. You know, this is an interesting business because I think there's a lot of people interested in sort of doing these types of operations these days, and it probably is growing in a nonlinear fashion every single day. I guess it'd be interesting to understand. I think a company like this one, which has the benefit of operating in such a crowded market, would probably do well to articulate how they're different from, you know, for the auto ML stuff from Google's auto ML, and then for deploying on like Banana or deploying on any Google or SageMaker or any one of those other, admittedly SageMaker is a bit different, any one of those other options, because there's a lot. And I imagine these guys do have some reason why they're better. I mean, maybe they have their own servers. That would be exciting if that's the case. And so maybe the pricing is a bit better, or you have access to like a degree of scale that I can't get with Google. But anyway, I would definitely highlight that. I don't know why it says sing in instead of login. I mean, maybe that's sort of like a fun little tidbit there, but I'd probably just call it sign in. Maybe it's a typo.
typo. Yeah. All right. Thanks very much, Daniel. I
Cool.
think those are all the projects we have today. So today's a bit of a shorter one, but thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rishi, for setting it up. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you all.